Hi students, today we're going to talk about some jazz, big culture icon of American history. Jazz really started in the early 1800s in the deep American South, basically by the slaves that were down there. They would sing about the trials and tribulations and the pain that they were suffering during their everyday lives out in the fields. And it just came from call and response. You'd have a guy calling out about what he's thinking right at that moment, and then everyone else would answer. Started a lot in the fields and into the church, so there's a lot of gospel influence too. So it was never really organized. It was just kind of in that focus for most of the 18th century until it really started up and around the hub of New Orleans down in Louisiana. That's kind of the central hub of where jazz came from in American history. Started out with Louis Armstrong's a big name. He was a trumpeter, and then he would just take out what he learned from the history that he was thinking about and put it to his trumpet. He was probably the biggest first name that was going on at that time. And then, as we moved into the roaring 20s, it started to move into big bands. You wouldn't have just one guy or a couple guys. You'd have 5 saxophones, 5 trombones, 5 trumpets, a rhythm section, and it really went into the clubs at that time for dancing, drinking, partying it up, and that was really the standard for about 20 years after that. Right up until World War II, they would you'd have these big bands that would travel all around the world. You'd have set standards that they would be known for. They would play, and they'd be a real barn burner at all the clubs. The Great Depression really kind of thinned out the crowd of a number of big bands. Duke Ellington survived, Count Basie survived, but it really kind of no one could travel because no one had any money to do that. So that was really, it was kind of a dwindling number up until World War II. And they had a couple of traveling bands into Europe for the troops. So it really got Europe exposed to what was happening in America in terms of jazz. So post World War II is kind of when things changed. You had the big bands, the small things like Louis Armstrong, the standards. After World War II came and ended, a lot of soldiers brought back what they had learned in Europe and started to finagle with the scales, the main scales that they had. So it really started to change what people were going to listen to, and that's when bebop was born. If jazz swing bands were like a hybrid car, bebop would be like a top thrill dragster. Real busy, lots of notes. If you listen to it, you're kind of just overwhelmed by what's going on, but that was where jazz was at that time. A lot of busy scales up and down, up and around. It kind of went into smaller groups, quintets, quartets, maybe just a piano and a drum and a lead guy. That was kind of right after World War II. It didn't last very long because jazz really started to branch out after that. We went to cool jazz with Miles Davis, Dave Brubeck, John Coltrane. It was kind of the exact opposite of what bebop was. Real kind of laid back, very simple but very emotional songs. What Dave Brubeck was known for in cool jazz was his manipulation of time signatures. He had a couple really good albums that were all kind of not necessarily 4/4 time, something you could really dance to, but just kind of sit back and think. This is kind of when it went really intellectual. He had a lot of 5/4 time, 9 beats per measure, 5 beats per measure, 11 beats per measure. I would say the 50s and 60s was when people really started to say, well, what can we do with jazz? We know what it is. Where do we want to take it? And there are a lot of big names that you probably recognize are from that era. After that, we have New York City, Chicago, LA was becoming a big hub for jazz. A lot of different flavors are getting mixed in, and kind of into avant-garde, kind of just whatever you're feeling, man. Not really a set standard of anything, just guys just want to get together and jam and put on a show, and if you're ready to listen, that's what you would do. So that's kind of where we are today. I think big bands have come back a lot. There's the Big Fat Band out in LA is probably the biggest one today. Otherwise, most universities have a band, schools have bands, but I'd say it's pretty much a mixture of everything from small groups, big bands, and then they're all playing different styles of where it is today. All right, so we're going to look at a little bit about jazz music, what it really essentially is. If you you guys go to church and you're singing a hymn that's not jazz, it's a very different mix of what a musical scale is. Usually in churches, and the organ is playing, it's all major and happy, or it resolves itself. When you say amen, it's all major, it sounds happy. Jazz is kind of a mix of a couple minor intonations, really complex scales on a piano. So you would never find jazz in your church. Jazz is essentially, as a major scale, it has a couple minor tones, which throws your ear for a loop, because you're like, oh, I want to keep listening, because it needs to resolve itself. I want to see if it ever, the scale or chords ever go happy. But jazz essentially kind of comes back from the American South in the 1800s of singing about your pain that you have, singing about what your family's going through, the trials of your everyday life. And that's why it's based off of minor scales and minor tones that your mind's kind of like, oh, I need to resolve that. It's a little bit sad. It's not sad music, but it's based off very deep emotions, and on a piano it plays into minor chords. And I will play some scales later. We'll walk through a major scale, a minor scale, another minor scale, then we'll eventually see how that moves to the blues scale. Alright, so I'm going to play 4 scales for you. We're going to start off with kind of the churchy one. Everything's going to be major chord. The second one I will play is what they call a Melidian scale, which has a slight minor tone at the very end of the scale. I'll kind of raise my eyes and you'll hear it. The third scale is what we call a Dorian mode, which is very minor. And then the last one will be the blues scale that we were talking about. So you'll kind of see the progression of, everything's happy, emotional, and then, what essentially evolved into the blues. All right, here we go. So pretty easy. So now, on the 7th note, you'll hear it'll be different. So it kind of leaves us as, oh, that sounded kind of funny. It's a little bit unresolved. It doesn't feel finished. And that's going to get even more change with the third scale. It'll be on the 3rd and the 7th note. So we're slowly changing and changing, and this will be what eventually evolved into the blues scale.